Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Jeff Maurer. He's a former senior writer at Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, and he writes the Substack I Might Be Wrong, where you can find him writing about politics, comedy, and everything in between. Today we're talking about political comedy. I've had a feeling for a long time that political comedy just simply isn't as good as it used to be. I personally remember coming up, I was in college and high school during the years when Jon Stewart first got started at The Daily Show, and he became this cultural phenomenon criticizing the Bush administration, and really all sorts of politicians, to be fair, but mostly the Bush administration. And I remember that as just the sharpest, most insightful, funniest thing that was happening. It was like a revolution on television. But then it seems to me, in my perception, that political comedy has gotten a lot worse. It's not as funny anymore. Maybe it's preachy. But that's just my perception. Maybe I'm just one of those guys who thinks everything was the best when he was in college, like people do with music. So we have an expert here to think about it with us. Jeff Maurer, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoy this podcast, legitimately. I would say that even if I didn't mean it, but I actually do mean it. I love this podcast.
Well, I appreciate whether you're boosting my ego because it's legitimate or just to get brownie points. Either way,
we'll never know. We'll never know. But I do actually like this podcast. But I would say that if I didn't. So,
well, that mystery aside, let's talk about this. Is this just confirmation bias? Because I actually do worry about this. Because everybody thinks that music from when they are 18 to 25 is the best music that's ever been created. And, you know, you worked in this space for a while, and I was in college during this time, and we were both kind of formed in our formative years, maybe, I don't know, during the time when Jon Stewart and maybe a little bit the Colbert Report were happening. Is this just confirmation bias? Are we just a bunch of, like, boomers talking about how it was better in our day? Or has something actually changed?
Yeah, you know, we should recognize it's impossible to say. The formulation of what you were talking about that I've heard is the best SNL cast is the cast that was on when you were 12, which is, you know, hey, that's the way I feel. You know, hey, Mike Myers, Dana Carvey, it didn't get any better than that. But that's clearly a product of your age. So yes, let's just add an asterisk to this entire discussion. Nonetheless, you know, and I've worked in this field and I think about it a lot. I think there's no denying that in the mid-2000s, The Daily Show was a powerhouse show.
Let's talk about what came before
legendary
that,
show.
Too. Let's talk about, like, late night before Jon Stewart. They would make jokes about the president, but it all seemed very, like, an anodyne, like, very tame. You know, hey, Bill Clinton, you know, rah, 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 rah. Like,
it was the,
you know,
the
it's very
DJ Tron
Badum-Tiss kind of comedy.
The DJ Tron 5000 from The Simpsons. Those clowns in Congress have done it again. What a bunch of clowns.
Yeah.
If people remember that joke. Well, in the Johnny Carson era, Johnny didn't give his opinion. You didn't actually know where Johnny Carson stood on this stuff. Kind of famously, they say that Johnny would get letters from Republicans and Democrats saying, I know that you secretly agree with me. You never knew where Johnny stood. Jon Stewart changed that, and it really was innovative at the time. And I think a lot of people, I mean, I would include myself in this, found it very refreshing at the time that instead of this attitude that was sort of, here's what happened in the news, but hey, who can say what's right and what's wrong? Who can say what's good and what's bad? It gave it a little more edge when Jon Stewart actually, at the end of the segment, gave you his actual opinion. We kind of forget how different that was, how groundbreaking that was. And I think in a landscape where all of the political comedy was the Johnny Carson style, where it doesn't really have an opinion in it, that was kind of a breath of fresh air. That was a nice change of pace.
So what happened then, I guess? I kind of agree with you that this is a breath of fresh air. It really felt like the whole cliched idea of comedians speak truth to power. That actually felt like, to me, as a young, impressionable college kid, like it was happening. So if it has declined, do you think, is there a story? Is there a narrative why?
Maybe. So, first of all, I'm not sure I can say, it's worse now. I'm a big believer in Sturgeon's Law, which is that 90% of everything is crap. So let's recognize, like, there's always good stuff and bad stuff. That is just universally true. Let's focus on, for a second, what we can objectively verify. What we can objectively verify is that there are now a billion Daily Show type shows. I mean, I worked for one of them last week. Tonight, we used to use the phrase the Daily Show universe of shows, which meant us, Colbert, at least when that was still the Colbert Report, us, Colbert, the Nightly Show with Larry Wilmore was around for a while, Sam B., Jordan Klepper was around for a while. There are a billion of these shows. I wrote this article for my Substack called The Religious Left is Turning Comedy into Christian Rock, which captures a lot of my thoughts on this topic. And I counted up the number of political comedy shows, and I think the number is like 17. And that's not 17 on right now, but that's 17 on at some point in the last couple of years, because obviously like Hassan Minhaj is not on anymore. Jordan Klepper's not on anymore. It's a hell of a lot of shows. So if nothing else, the market got extremely saturated with this kind of content.
One of the things that I notice when I watch these shows is that I've seen a rise in something that I call Claptor. And I didn't invent this phrase. I read this somewhere. But, rather than actually getting a laugh and saying something that's funny, you kind of have this line. And I don't know, I could pick on several people here. I think John Oliver does it to some extent. I think Samantha Bee is particularly bad at it, where she'll read a thing about like Texas has introduced a new abortion law that would restrict abortion rights. And then she'll just say something like, and you'll wonder why women hate you. And the audience will go like crazy and clap. And like there's energy there. It's doing something. Like people, I don't want to make fun too much because people are genuinely excited. They're having an emotional reaction to that.
Right.
But it also doesn't seem like a joke.
It doesn't seem like a joke because it's objectively not a joke. And you're right that Claptor is a thing comedians talk about a lot. I think here's the reality. The reality is, and again, comedians in late night shows, we talk about this a lot. So this is sort of well-explored territory in that world. Writing a joke is really hard. Writing a joke that people are going to laugh at, that's tough. And even when it's your goddamn job, you just sit there with your head in your hands for a half an hour going like, what's this like? What's this like? Because so many jokes are in that formulation. That's like if you sent a penguin to college or whatever. It's hard. It's hard to come up with a joke, as I have just proven.
I can definitely
by
see that you were a John Oliver
joke.
writer, by the way.
We had so many goddamned animals on that show. And by the way, the graphic helps sell the penguin going to college. You might not laugh at it now, but when you see the penguin in that little mortarboard, you'll laugh at it then. But the point is, writing a joke is hard. Having an opinion, that's easy. At this moment where we're all kind of reacting to the shooting in Texas, if you say, we got to do something about guns, like people are going to clap at that. People are going to react to that. As you said, it's something. I believe that's an exact quote from what you just said. And I think it captures it pretty well. It's something. It's not laughter, but it's a reaction. So if you can't write a joke, a lot of times you just write an opinion, and at least there will be noise, and you'll call that good enough.
And I mean, I think the people who do this, on some level, they may not be 100% aware that they're doing it or how bad it is, but sometimes they are. I think there's varying degrees of awareness. There's one stand-up special I'm actually thinking about that got a ton of critical acclaim. It may be one of the most acclaimed stand-up specials of all time, maybe, according to which set of critics you pay attention to. It was by a comedian named Hannah Gadsby, and the stand-up special was called Nanette.
Nanette, of course.
And it's very famous, and it starts out with 10 to 15 minutes, I think, of traditional kind of light banter stand-up comedy. And then like the last 45 minutes of it are just a searing condemnation of all sorts of bigotry and sexism and homophobia and transphobia. I think it's been a long time since I saw it. I don't remember every subject. But like 45 minutes straight at the end with almost no jokes and just kind of straight political evangelism almost. Mm-hmm. And it clearly the message very upfront was this should not be funny. I made some jokes earlier. None of this is really funny though. Pay attention to what's happening in society. And again, like that clearly moved a lot of people. That was emotional for people. And I don't want to denigrate it as like this is bad necessarily, but it seems to me that it's moving in a direction that is just different from what we normally associate with comedy.
Yeah. I think there's a place for that. I think there's a place for stuff that's funny and just purely funny and has no point, no larger message. And I think there's a place for stuff that has a message. When I was growing up, when I was, really being influenced by comedy and thinking, what do I really love? What do I not like so much? The two biggies for me is I loved The Daily Show and I loved Conan. And The Daily Show had a message in it, and Conan had no message in it whatsoever. I liked that mix. I liked having, the two different parts to my meal, the, completely funny part and the funny but also has a point part. By the way, now Nanette specifically, I am on record with my thoughts on Nanette in an article on my Substack called, "Is There Even the Slightest Chance That We as a Nation Are Becoming Somewhat Humorless?" This was largely in response to the Will Smith slap, but I get into Hannah Gadsby and Nanette. And again, I think there's a spot for that. I think there's a place for that. I wouldn't want all the stuff that's not comedy to somehow crowd out the stuff that is comedy. I sometimes kind of feel like that's happening. Again, I talked about the proliferation of the political comedy shows. 17 is probably too many. We probably don't need 17. One of my biggest worries when I was at Last Week Tonight, and again, I would talk about this openly with the other writers, the big worry was just becoming an MSNBC show. We didn't want to just be MSNBC, and that kind of, I think, happens when the message starts to crowd out the jokes.
Cards on the table, I enjoyed Nanette during the watching of it. I would never watch it again. I would never quote it because it's just not that funny, but it did impact me. And the thing I worry about is not Nanette itself, which I think was one of the best examples of, if you're not going to be that funny, at least have a really searing message that gets through to people. I worry about other stuff where they're attempting to do that and they don't succeed. Like, Have you seen the movie Don't Look Up?
Yes, I have.
To me, that's an example of somebody trying to be preachy and just coming off as preachy and awful and unfunny, and there's no upside there. I don't know.
Before I wrote for Last Week Tonight, I was a speechwriter for the EPA for almost 9 years. So, climate change is an issue I feel very strongly about and have written about a lot. And yeah, I feel like that movie kind of botched the message. It was not a great moment in political commentary. So yeah, that if you can't be funny, have a message. But if you are going to have a message, it needs to be, like an intelligent one, I would think. And then if you fail on both fronts, then what are you offering?
One of the other things you've mentioned in some of the writing that you do on your Substack, which is I Might Be Wrong, for those who are listening, we're going to have that linked in the show notes. But one of the things you noted is that you're somewhat afraid that in the end, we're headed in the direction where comedy is judged by the message that it sends and not whether or not it's funny. Why are you afraid of that?
Because of stand-up. Because that was kind of the way I saw it trending in stand-up. So when COVID hit, I stopped doing stand-up, and I don't know if I'm ever going to go back because I had a real complicated relationship with it before COVID, where the audiences are getting very split. It's like you either have a right-wing audience or you have a left-wing audience, and both of them will limit what you can say. And there were just so many nights where I thought, I'm not having fun. It doesn't feel like we've all had a couple drinks and we're all grown-ups and I'm up here saying what I want and we're having some fun. It felt like, be careful what you say, watch where you go. And that was a right-wing and a left-wing phenomenon. And it made it a lot less fun. And it felt like things were less funny. I got to say, look, so Hacks won the Emmy for Best Comedy. If Hacks is the funniest show on television, then my fucking God, what has happened to us? I'm sorry, I'm sure the people who write Hacks are very nice people, and I actually enjoyed the show on some levels, but like belly laughs, no, I did not get belly laughs from Hacks.
I do want to talk about some of the good comedy that still exists out there. We're going to name a lot of really terrible comedy and insult a lot of people here, and that's fine. Yeah. None of them listen to this podcast, so it'll be cool. Good. But before we get there, I don't know. I want to keep exploring this because I wonder from the inside, from like a writer's room perspective, you talked about the stand-up perspective, but from a comedic writer's room, like you'd have at John Oliver or any of these other shows where you've got a dozen people pitching jokes and pitching ideas, do you think that there's more caution and fear of I don't know, cancellation or fear of being edgy in some of these things, in some of these writers' rooms?
From what people who are still in that environment tell me, they tell me yes. But then again, it's like the people I know in these environments is like, these are my friends. These are people who kind of see the world the way I do, people who kind of feel that there needs to be a wide berth for comedians to take some risks and, be kind of offensive sometimes. The writer's room when I was at Last Week Tonight, and by the way, the writer's room I was in at Last Week Tonight is 100% gone. There is no overlap. That writer's room changed, and actually changed pretty quickly. It changed. We had 100% turnover in basically 2 seasons. We had the same people through season 4, and then through seasons 5 and season 6, we changed 100%. By season 7, it is a whole new room. I felt the room I was in was kind of like I thought a comedy writer's room would be, which is we were always telling like extremely offensive jokes. If you planted a microphone in that room for 5 minutes, all of us are going to be canceled at a minimum and, banished to the woods more likely. It was just constantly, horrible things, but all said, knowing that, hey, we know each other. We know this is a joke. This is how we show affection for each other. It was a hell of a good time. The people I talk to, they tell me that many environments are kind of different. Is that universally true? I'm sure it's not universally true. I'm sure it depends on the show. And, I'll add a caveat, like there is certainly such a thing as going too far. It is very true that some writers' rooms back in the day, from what I hear, I wasn't there, were boys' clubs. Everyone seems to agree on that. I don't think anybody wants to go back to the environment where it really is like a frat house. But yes, from what I know, people say it's just people are more guarded. That is what I hear.
I've been thinking about this in anticipation of the episode. And when I think about the fact that political comedy seems to have gotten worse, there are 2 things that strike me. Number one is this idea of being afraid of making edgy jokes because the culture is a little bit more PC now, or a little bit more woke, or, whatever term you want to use. These terms are very contentious themselves to talk about wokeness or to talk about PC. And I don't want to set anybody off, but that's the general trend, whatever you want to call it. But I also think, there's always been people who get mad at comedians for doing edgy jokes. I think about Tipper Gore yelling at like musicians and Eminem or whatever. And there's always been people who get really righteously angry at edgy comedians or at musicians who are doing death metal and the rap where they're killing people. And I'm trying to channel my 65-year-old white lady voice.
Yeah, exactly. The kids listening to the rap music. Yeah.
So what's changed then? It like that to me seems like an argument that it's not really wokeness, that there's something else going on. Yeah. If people have always been getting righteously, all the way back to Lenny Bruce getting thrown in jail for talking about women's vulvas or whatever. I don't know. Whatever Lenny Bruce did. Famous, if you're not familiar.
Vulva bit was a good bit.
I should clarify for people who are not American, perhaps. Lenny Bruce was a famous comedian in like the 60s, 70s-ish era.
50s and 60s, yeah.
50s and 60s. And he was famous for doing really provocative stuff that would get him thrown in jail and standing up for free speech as a comedian.
And he frequently got literally thrown in jail.
But so what's changed? If people have always gotten mad at this, what's changed?
This time I actually have an answer. Twitter. It's Twitter. It's Twitter and it's social media. Twitter and social media have made it so much easier to form a mob. Back in the day, look, okay, if you're watching the Super Bowl in 2003 or whatever it was, and you see Janet Jackson's boob, and that boob sends you into a rage, and you are furious, okay, what do you have to do? You have to, figure out who to call at ABC. Maybe you're going to sit down and write a letter. You got to print it out. You got an old inkjet printer back then. You got to go refill the cartridge or whatever. Find a stamp. It's a whole hassle. Now, you can just instantly react to it. And by the way, if you didn't see the boob, your friends certainly saw the boob. So the second you get on Twitter or Facebook, you're going to find out about the boob. There's really no missing the boob these days. it's so easy to get.
We're going to use that as a direct quote, by the way. There's no missing the boob. Jeff Maurer.
There's no missing the boob. That sounds like it would be good on a t-shirt. I am going to put some merch together with that phrase on it. But yeah, there's no missing the boob these days. And it is now a right-wing and left-wing phenomenon. You're right. It used to basically just be a right-wing phenomenon. It used to be Helen Lovejoy. Won't somebody think of the children? That's what it used to be. And that's certainly the environment I came up in as somebody who started doing comedy in the mid-2000s. Now, anybody can get a mob together. And also they have an incentive to do it because there's a lot of, obviously, virtue signaling and moral posturing, and then people who are kind of building their brand on getting outraged about stuff. So I think that part we actually know. It is really easy to get a mob together on Twitter or on Facebook or some other social media. And when you get that mob together, it's very likely that the network or the movie studio or whoever the hell is going to go, Jesus, this is just not worth it, and give in to them.
This is something I struggle with because look, everybody agrees with cancel culture to some extent, in terms of like outright Nazis should probably be shamed on Twitter at right. a bare minimum, even if you don't want to take away their right to speak, social condemnation of actual Nazism, as an example, is probably a good thing.
Yes.
I'm not stepping into controversial waters there.
I don't think so. No, I think anyone who
and the question is where do you go? Because I'm just as an example, the podcast that I'm recording tomorrow after this one is about the white nationalist takeover of the Libertarian Party.
Which, based on your comments, I assume you support.
Don't
you
get me canceled.
You just defended the right to speak. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I mean it's fine. But no, so legitimately, there's a white nationalist group that has taken over the organs of the Libertarian Party. They won 17 out of 17 seats on their national committee. It's happened. It's done.
That's a lot. That's more than half.
Yeah, it's control. And the guy that they want to nominate for president in the Libertarian Party in 2024 is a comedian named Dave Smith. And Dave Smith is a white nationalist who talks about how he thinks black people are genetically less intelligent than white people, and he hangs around with Nick Fuentes and Stefan Molyneux and Richard Spencer and basically a who's who of like neo-Nazi world. And when I think about that comedian getting shouted off of Twitter, it gives me like a warm feeling in my heart. Mm-hmm. But when I think about like, I don't know, I'm struggling to think of something more mild than that. But like, I don't know, Aziz Ansari.
Isn't literally everything more mild than that?
Yeah. But like Aziz Ansari basically seemed like he had a bad, awkward date and he got canceled for a year or two. And that, like, I don't know where the middle ground is other than just you have to judge it, each situation on its merits. I don't, but that's not satisfying as a rule.
It's not satisfying, and yet it might be the best rule we can come up with. I write about free speech and what you might call censorship, what some people would call censorship, content moderation on social media. I write about that a fair amount, and it is frustrating because I agree. I don't think there are any hard rules in this area. Because if you think about it for 2 seconds, you do realize that, okay, social media does need some content moderation. You can't, I mean, first there
Thank
are
you,
bots.
Elon Musk.
It does need some. You can't have bots. You can't have people, making literal death threats, literal explicit death threats, trying to get people killed. There's all sorts of really, really bad, unsavory stuff. I mean, child pornography, for example. There has to be some content moderation, which is why people like me who think free speech is valuable, even when it's speech I strongly disagree with, I end up saying squishy things like, I would like to see Twitter and Facebook use a light hand with content moderation. Unfortunately, that's the best phrasing I can come up with. I don't want them using a heavy hand because I worry that they might go too far in stifling speech that should exist. It's really easy to think of examples of this. We've probably seen a couple examples of this.
Well, and I don't even think that is really even in the conversation. I think the conversation really is about the severe level of social condemnation that people will get, where they're not banned from Twitter, but they are chased off Twitter to some extent.
And that's kind of the cultural element of what we're talking about, right? Because you're right. It's not that Twitter is going to remove person X. It might just be that person X suffers a big career setback because Twitter got on them. A week ago, Twitter was furious at John Mulaney for having Dave Chappelle on a stand-up show. So they came after John Mulaney. And I know a lot of times people say, oh, what's the big deal? John Mulaney will be fine, and John Mulaney will be fine. What's the problem with this career setback? It's less about the setback that happens to the person and more about the, as you hear the phrase, chilling effect that happens to all of comedy, where a lot of comedians just go, oh, Jesus, I'm just be very careful. It's not worth it. And I'm telling you, as someone who works in the field, that is real. That is real. That happens all the time, whether you're putting your stand-up act together or you're working on a late-night show. You'll have joke A, joke B. Joke B, there's like a 1 in 100 shot somebody might get offended by it. And maybe it's a little bit better, but you know what? You go, oh, to hell with it. I just don't want the trouble. And you go with joke A, which is maybe not as good. So you're right. It's not just decisions being made by Twitter and Facebook. It's also just kind of a cultural atmosphere where people are enacting very harsh penalties for very minor infractions. And I agree that is a big part of the problem.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it also seems like there's a factor here where, you know, if you're Lenny Bruce and some stuck-up conservative-ish politician tries to throw you in jail, that's great for you.
It's awesome.
That's awesome. And
Yeah.
but today it's more like it's your own team. It's your own tribe trying to police you, because most comedians, at least traditionally, most comedians have leaned very liberal.
Yeah.
And well, maybe there's a Joe Rogan style like pushback against that, but it's different when it's your own tribe getting angry at you, because this is something I say all the time. You can only get canceled by your own people. You know, if Ben Shapiro can't be canceled by Twitter because Ben Shapiro is a conservative, that's not his base of support. If Twitter's mad at him, that fine. You know,
Yeah.
But
that is,
but a liberal comedian can be canceled by Twitter.
that is 100% true. I mean, I think back to when I was a stupid 25-year-old stand-up comic, and this is 2005, and I'm on stage going like, Bush, oh man, fuck Bush. Really, really edgy stuff, right? Or so I thought. I thought I was pushing the envelope, but you know what I was doing? I was in Washington, D.C. I was doing a lot of rooms where people agreed with me, and yeah, I if anyone got mad at me, then yes, they were the stick in the mud conservative. They were basically John Lithgow in Footloose, and I got to be like the rebel, right? Because that's out-group condemnation. Who fucking cares? It's actually good for my brand. You are completely right that in-group condemnation, when it's coming from your own side, I mean, think of the psychological effect of that. Like, these are people you thought were your friends. This is where you thought you fit in, and now they're mad at you. People will go to great lengths to avoid that. And it is especially potent in comedy because, as you mentioned, most comedians are on the left. This is, we could get into the reasons for that. It has something to do with your disposition towards authority. Nonetheless, it is just a fact. There are far more comedians on the left than on the right. So now that you have this very potent form of, it's not censorship, but you're right, extreme condemnation for very minor infractions of rules that not even everybody knows. Very often you're like, what are the rules? I don't know. Let me just play it safe. That is a much more potent medicine in terms of shutting down comedy because it's coming from the left.
So I think that that's probably part of the story. I think there's something there, but I also don't know that I buy that it's like the entire story here. To me, there's also something about the particular person of Donald Trump that has destroyed political satire to some extent, where I'm curious about your thoughts on this, because I've thought for a long time it's just almost impossible to satirize Trump in that he is so much himself. He is so shameless, and he has never apologized for anything. He's got this, I will never back down, I will never apologize, I will never admit I'm wrong. And like watching an actual Trump press conference or rally or whatever is much funnier than watching SNL or watching somebody's Trump impression. It just is.
Yeah. Oh, where to start with that guy? And I was there in the thick of it. I wrote Philosophy Tonight 2014 through 2020. So I was right in the meat of it. And to a certain extent, he beat me. To a certain extent, he is part of the reason that I am sitting here now, not a late night comedy writer. Because that guy, holy shit. Okay, first thing, it led to a lot of bad comedy because you are right. How do you parody that guy? He is a parody. He is a walking parody. And so much of the stuff, it's like Kofifi is just inherently weird. The way he looks is inherently weird. It's like Twitter did 9/10 of it because it's such low-hanging fruit. Like, you don't need to bring in a professional to make fun of this guy. So, yeah, we got so saturated with Trump humor that a lot of it was really bad. And then it also, as many people have observed, Trump kind of fried people's brains. And I think to a certain extent, I was one of those people. I really do not like the guy. I do not like the guy. I think he was a very bad president. I do not want to see him be president again. I will leave it at that. But obviously that is massively understating how I felt about the guy. And that's not a very funny mindset, is it? Not a very funny mindset to think, holy shit, what is happening to our democracy? Are we, can we still vote and have the outcome of that vote be recognized? These are not funny areas. These are not funny thoughts. I think that's a second reason why things got not very funny during that time. Certainly it's a big contrast to, hey, Dick Cheney shot an old guy in the face, parentheses, but the old guy's going to be okay. I mean, that's funny. A lot of the Trump stuff is just not very funny. And we could probably talk for hours about the effects he had on comedy and why there were 100 different effects, none of them good. I am certainly glad to be out of that era of comedy writing.
There was something else you mentioned there that I think has also been a factor. And I'll introduce this as a third factor. If we think, PC culture or wokeness or whatever you want to call it, fear of cancellation is number one. Trump being this bizarre force that can't be parodied is number two. Number three, you mentioned this. You said 90% of it gets done on Twitter within the first 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. I wonder if we think that some of the political comedy has declined, whether that's late night comedy or whether it's stand up or these kind of Daily Show universe stuff. If that's declined, is it because all the good jokes have already been told on Twitter? Is social media where you actually find like the real cutting edge, absurdist stuff?
Well, I agreed with every word except for cutting edge. But this is an excellent point, and one I think that comedy writers don't want to talk about very much because we don't want to suggest that perhaps we're becoming obsolete or perhaps anybody can do our jobs. But it is definitely true that if we're talking about mid-2000s Daily Show, Colbert Report, one of the things they did was they found funny stuff and brought it to you. And as a late-night comedy writer, I can tell you that is actually a huge part of the job. I don't think people realize this. A big part of being a comedy writer, especially if you're like a monologue writer or a late-night writer, is finding funny stuff. That is a huge part of it. There are writers I knew who kind of specialized in finding funny stuff. These days, Twitter finds this stuff.
And by this, you mean just not necessarily they wouldn't write a joke, but they would find a premise or find a news article or a situation that was just inherently funny, and then somebody else could fill in jokes.
The starting point is extraordinarily important. When you have a funny clip, writing a joke off a funny clip is 100 times easier than writing a joke off of a not funny clip. I mean, last week tonight, we do these jokes called gang jokes, where basically you have everyone in the room and you're given the clip and you just sit in the room until you write like 15 jokes. You give us a funny clip, we'll do 15 jokes in 5 minutes. It's really that easy. You give us a hard clip, it'll take an hour. It's just worlds different. And you've got a good clip when you come off it and the audience is already laughing. I think of things like, I just wrote about gun control this week, and I was reminded of the 30 to 50 feral hogs tweet. And I just thought, my God, that 30 to 50 feral hogs tweet, that is so fucking funny. It is just money in the bank. And back in the day, you wouldn't have heard about 30 to 50 feral hogs until Jon Stewart told you about it at 11 p.m. Now you find out about it instantly. It's on Twitter. So yeah, that part of the job has kind of been usurped by Twitter a little bit.
I think of something like the Rudy Giuliani press conference where it's hot and there's literally like hair dye running down his face and he doesn't know it.
Yeah. And he's in the wrong place.
Right? And he's not in front of the Four Seasons Hotel. He's in front of like Four Seasons gardening equipment or something like that. And
yeah, that's straight out of Veep. That's straight out of Veep. And yes, that was meat and drink for a late night comedy show. But now Twitter basically picks the bone dry before late night can get there.
And look, at Sturgeon's Law, it applies here. Probably twice. On Twitter, probably not 90% of everything is bullshit. Probably 99% of everything is shit on Twitter. But I really do think that if you are dedicated to plumbing the depths of Twitter, you will find like the craziest, absurdist humor that just... I honestly feel like I laugh reading Twitter more often than I laugh watching television sometimes.
I'm a believer. I believe the funniest Twitter account, possibly the funniest thing in the world, is the Twitter account Cats Acting Like Weird Little Guys. I, as a comedy writer, am comfortable with the fact that cats are just funnier than we are. You know, when you're beat, you're beat. You got to admit it. And that is kind of a statement, though, first about the awesomeness of cats. I'm strongly pro-cat. But, yeah, maybe also about the state of television. There used to be shows that I love. There's still good shows on TV. I think You Should Leave with Tim Robinson's a very funny show. There's still funny stuff on TV. Rick and Morty's funny. It can still happen. Humanity has not lost the capacity to be funny. There's still good stuff out there. But, yeah, if I'm being honest, I would say it's less than it used to be.
So let's talk about this, because I want to give a second recommendation to Tim Robinson. If you haven't watched I Think You Should Leave, very, very funny show. Like,
Very
start
funny.
with the ghost tour sketch, start with the banana sketch, start with the sloppy steaks. If
The
you're
hot
wondering
dog
what these are,
sketches.
just Google sloppy steaks, and I promise you won't regret it. But beyond that, I want to ask about political comedy, because we've been talking trash about a lot of people, and I said that I would give us an opportunity to give some compliments. Is there any political comedy out there that you do think is actually pretty well done, that is put together? It's funny, it still is comedy and not just Claptor? Is there anything you would signal out?
All of the shows have, Colbert, Seth Meyers, Last Week Tonight, all of the shows have good stuff and bad stuff. And now that I've got a little distance from it, and I'm not so involved and so, let's be honest, like nervous about getting fired all the time, which you are if you have one of these jobs, I can see that, look, when I was there, it was a mixed bag. It was a mixed bag. Stuff that I wrote, it was a mixed bag. There's stuff I wrote that I look back at and I think, Jesus Christ, Maurer, what were you doing? I mean, Claptor? Yeah, I did Claptor. Part of that is because I was, a very, very political, strongly feeling guy in my early 30s, and part of it is because sometimes I couldn't write a joke, so I went with the Claptor, because that's what you do. This is the reality of these jobs. I'm sure... Look, anyone who's being honest with themselves in their own job knows some days you got it and some days you don't. So all of these shows have a mix of good stuff and bad stuff, and I still sometimes watch them, and there's always one in there I'm like, that one's solid. It's always a mix. I'm not sure if any show has really claimed the mantle as like the clearinghouse of the good stuff right now. I mean, we mentioned old Daily Show and Colbert. Those were kind of classic shows. No, I don't think anybody has really that title right now, I would say.
I think it's also just harder, like you said, in today's fractured media environment and with social media everywhere. It's hard to be the king of anything, in the way that Jon Stewart was the first and he was just the king for as long as he did it, basically.
Yeah, there's only one first.
I will give one recommendation, because I tried to watch a bunch of cringe political comedy in anticipation of this show. And there was one show that actually stands out to me. It's not on your list. It's a newer show. Oh. You have these lists of like, here's all the 17 shows that have been released. Have you heard of Zway?
I have never heard of Zway.
She is a black female comedian, spelled Ziwe, for anybody who wants to look this up.
Was she on Succession?
I'm not sure if she was on Succession.
Okay.
She might have. I mean, she might have been. I don't think she was on Succession. But she's a comedian. She has a show, and it's very like web formatted. And I'm trying to think of how to describe it. It's like she's got the energy as a host of like, those morning show people who are like, and this person's dog can jump through hoops, like that kind of host on a morning show. Mm-hmm. She brings that kind of energy, like that's her persona, but the show is explicitly trying to cancel all of its guests, like straight up just attacking them relentlessly, and doing it with this like really fake smile. Like I don't know, she had Phoebe Bridgers on, who's a musician, and she asked Phoebe Bridgers, "Are you an ally to the black community?" Phoebe Bridgers kind of nods like, "Yeah." "Would you feature a black woman on your record?" "Yeah." "Name Zway?" And then basically it goes into a bit about how if she doesn't get a spot on her record, she's racist.
Okay.
And then she's like, look, you're an ally. If I stabbed you in an alleyway, how would you describe me to 911? And Phoebe Bridgers is sitting there looking with like deer in the headlights look, like, what the fuck do I say here?
Those are solid bits.
Then she brings out like a couple of black children, and she's like, I want you to apologize to these black children for your inherent racism. just like bits like this where she like is going after everyone. And it's funny if they're like deer in the headlights. And it's also funny if they're not. Like she had Tom Hanks's idiot son on,
Sure.
Chet Hanks.
Chet Hanks, yeah.
And he speaks in a Jamaican accent. And she's like, do you feel like you're entitled to speak the way Jamaicans do? And he just goes like, yeah. And it's funny because he's an idiot. I don't know, but it's almost like a meta commentary on like, we're going to go after you to cancel you explicitly. And because it's so clear that we're going after you, you're not going to get canceled. Like, I don't know. It's very, very meta about the whole thing.
That's I mean, I'll check that out. That sounds funny. She it sounds like she's doing something kind of similar to what the Daily Show did back in the day, which is they would kind of go after people. And it's, I don't know, if it's funny enough, you can do it without being mean. So yeah, it sounds like it might be good. By the way, I Googled her while you were talking. She was on Succession. She was on Succession. She was kind of the show within the show on Succession in season 2. So there you go.
All right, I want to give you one more bit because she had another comic, Ilana Glazer, who's the girl from Broad City, one of the two girls from Broad City. She had her on because Ilana has a thing to promote. She did a special called "The Planet Is Burning." It's a stand-up set about climate change, which sounds hilarious.
I've seen that.
And so she brings it up. She's like, "You made a special called "The Planet Is Burning." Would you say you're profiting off of climate change?" And just, again, that deer in headlights moment, how much carbon do you think Broad City emitted?
What did she say?
She kind of gave this stammering answer about, I probably am. I think we're really publicizing climate change. Like we're.
I feel like some version of a stammering answer is basically all you can give there.
Yeah. No, it's great. And something about the meta format of just going after people like that is making them as uncomfortable. It's almost a little Eric Andre-esque.
Okay. Well, it sounds pretty funny. And certainly if you are, if you're doing comedy and the vibe is like, there are no limits here, you were kind of free here, that's a good vibe. I mean, that's what stand-up is in its best form. It's, hey, we're all adults here and I'm going to say damn near anything. And it can be very funny. It's very freeing. It's freeing to hear people, break taboos in a funny way. Mm-hmm. And, kind of say things you're not supposed to say, do things you're not supposed to do.
So let's talk about these things that, as you're talking about, things that we haven't seen before, things that are very popular. I'm talking, of course, about the number one political comedy show on television, Gutfeld. And I'm sure everyone of my listeners knows exactly who's. See, I don't even know how to pronounce the guy's damn name. Gutfeld. Yeah. So can you tell me about Gutfeld? Because this is something, I will be honest, before I read this on your Substack, I did not know this existed.
Yeah.
What should people know about Gutfeld?
What people should know about Gutfeld is that it is a comedy show on Fox News that airs at 11 p.m. Well, now I sound like I'm promoting it. For the record, I don't think it's a very good comedy show, but it is an enormously popular comedy show. And I crunched these numbers in, a piece on my Substack called Why Gutfeld is the highest rated political comedy show on cable, because it is the highest rated political comedy show by pure numbers. And I break this down in the article, like numbers are weird. You got to take all of them with a grain of salt. But by pure numbers, it is the highest rated political comedy show on TV by some distance. And a lot of that is Fox News has a huge audience and he's got part of it. But he has basically done the thing that conservatives dreamed of since Jon Stewart got big in the mid-2000s, which is to kind of make a conservative version of The Daily Show. And it's not just like The Daily Show in that it's mostly panels, so it's a bit of a hybrid between a comedy show and a news show. But it is, and it's completely telling that you didn't know his name because the circles you run in, the circles I run in, people don't really know about this show. I only know about this show because, by the way, in the early days of Last Week Tonight, we were all assigned to watch certain shows. We stopped doing this because we didn't riff off of Fox News much anymore. But myself and my office mate Jill Twiss were assigned to watch The Five, and Greg Gutfeld was on The Five. And we kind of became familiar with this guy. I can't say our opinion of him was extraordinarily high, and he has since gone on to have his own show, and look, people are watching it. People are watching it, which I think says something about the state of politics in this country, if nothing else.
This was just really funny to me because, I don't know, man. I think that back in the Jon Stewart days, there was this open question, like you said, why are there no conservative Jon Stewarts? Why are there no conservative stand-up comedians? And, people talk about, you have to be willing to talk truth to power, and conservatives are deferent to power. And so that's why it's never happened, blah, blah, blah. But it was a big open question, regardless of whether that's right or wrong. And now you come in and this thing is the biggest show on political comedy television, as you said, by some distance, by an enormous distance. If you look at things like how many minutes people watch total, it's not even close. And again, maybe it's just that Fox News has a big audience, but
that's part of it.
I just wonder, this whole thing is fascinating to me, the idea of conservative political comedy, because for a long time, people treated that like an oxymoron.
Yeah. And I get into this in the article. And you're right that conservatives really wanted a daily show. And for the record, they tried this. There was a show called The Half Hour News Hour that was on Fox that was 100% the conservative version of The Daily Show. It ran for, I think, like 10 weeks. It did not stick around. That flopped. People wondered, why can't there be a conservative version of this thing? And most people's answer did have something to do with, as you said, speaking truth to power. It's not that there are no conservative comedians out there, but there are fewer. I will say the ones that are out there tend to be more like libertarian conservatives, much more so than like religious conservatives. Very few Helen Lovejoys in comedy. So certainly it does have something to do with your orientation towards power and stuff like that. Whatever.
I think the right's move away from traditional conservatism, that Ronald Reagan-esque, Christian morality and uptight
moral
nature,
majority,
fiscal conservatism, focus on the family. All of that was never going to be successful at comedy. But if you think about kind of the Trumpist wing of the party and just how absurd they are, and just the fact that they're willing to break taboos is going to be funny to some people. And even if the listeners who I have don't find Trump's taboo breaking particularly funny because it's threatening to them, it is still breaking taboos, and there are people who will be titillated by that to some degree.
Certainly the wing of the party that was very, I would say the word would be reverent, very reverent, often explicitly religious. That is just not a very funny area.
Can we say stuffy?
Stuffy is a good word. Stuck up. Yeah, we can go through the thesaurus to describe the person that we can all picture. It's Mike Pence, basically. It's Mike Pence. Just a very,
the guy who calls
stuffy,
his wife mother.
Insecure. Yeah. Yes, that type of person. Not inherently funny, but of course his running mate, reverent, is not a word I would use to describe Donald Trump. And certainly Republicans who are more, maybe populism isn't perfect, but more libertarianism, and Gutfeld is, that is a better vibe for comedy. And I think there's something else going on, which is that Christian conservatives, the right wing of the Republican Party, they had a hell of a lot of power in the early 2000s. They had political power, obviously. They had the White House. They did well in Congress for many elections in a row. And then they had cultural power. You could cancel Ellen. They didn't literally cancel Ellen, but Ellen basically lost her sitcom when she came out as gay. Bill Maher got a talking to after he said something people perceived as favorable to Al-Qaeda after 9/11, and he got literally canceled, had to move to a different network. They had a lot of political and cultural power. Now it's kind of different. Now, I think the left has a lot of cultural power. I don't quite know how to measure that, but I think few people would disagree with the statement. The left has a lot of cultural power these days, and that actually puts people on the right in a bit of a position to portray themselves as the outsiders, portray themselves as the ones speaking truth to power. I think that's a lot of what Greg Gutfeld's doing, because I watched the show in order to write the article. And the world has changed, and therefore the orientation of comedians has changed a little bit too, I think.
One comparison I've seen is that there are specials I've watched, there are movies that I've watched where it really felt like I was being preached at. I think I said that word earlier, actually, and it really feels almost religious in nature. Like we go to this thing, that whether it's a stand-up set or a movie or whatever, not to laugh, but to receive the good word, to receive the good word and to bask in its glory and to realize how right we are in our opinions.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's deeply unfunny. And it is something we worried about in the writer's room at Last Week Tonight. I think people...
This is how I felt with that Leo movie. It's how I felt when I watched Don't Look Up. You know, I felt that, I'm just supposed to recognize myself as the righteous one, you know?
Yeah, it's not good. And it's sure as hell not funny. And, you know, I think I said earlier that we would talk about the worst thing we could become was an MSNBC show, because those just aren't funny. And that already exists. You know, again, it's like all this stuff can exist, but there needs to be some differentiation. Given that there already is an MSNBC, I'm not sure. We would talk about in the writer's room, let's not become the crappier version of MSNBC. And if you are just giving people talking points, if you are just... what you're describing sounds like the call to worship, you know, that I grew up with when I would go to church. It's like you have what's written in the pamphlet and like, here's the prayer we're all going to say. This is what we all believe. Yeah, the worst version of it kind of can become that. Personally, I'm not really in the market for that. I don't really enjoy that. But yeah, if you do it badly, it can become that sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. This is the point in the conversation. We're coming near the end where I would normally try to steer towards solutions. And, you know, a typical episode is me talking to a policy person, right? We're talking about the minimum wage or immigration or housing or whatever the case may be. And so the person will have a set of policy recommendations. You know, we need to do this, this, and this. This is the political process. If we have to compromise, here's the thing we'll go for. This is just a big cultural thing where I feel dumb asking you like, well, what do we do about it? But if you'll permit me, what do we do about this?
Sure. Well, why don't I give a very neoliberal podcast answer? I think the market is part of it. I guess actually a very neoliberal podcast answer would be the market is part of it, but then there's also a role for the government here. That's a very neoliberal answer. I'm not sure the second part is true here. You
play both sides.
You play mixed economy. Look, mixed economy. That's what does it. Mixed economy. That's what works. But that is a different topic for a different time. Let's focus on the market part of this here. Hollywood wants money. I don't think that's a controversial statement. People in Hollywood like to make money. They're not always great at it. Certainly, everyone exists in a culture, so that includes people who work in entertainment, people who make decisions about what show gets made and what the content of that show is. So you can't take culture out of it entirely. But look, Hollywood wants to make money, and when something works in Hollywood, they just ask for that thing over and over and over. My God, 5 years ago, Hollywood went, vampires, it's vampires. Vampires are what people like. Give me a show with vampires. And therefore, we had a million shows with vampires. I would say this kind of happened with political comedy. The Daily Show and Colbert Report were huge hits. And then, honestly, it's like Last Week Tonight came on. Our show did well. People in Hollywood were going, give me another one of those. Give me another one of those. Who's the newest Daily Show correspondent? Give that person a show. Hollywood does what works. If somebody does something new, something funny, something that works, and maybe Zway is that show. Once it works, once it's a hit, they will knock it off 1,000 times. So when somebody shows an alternate model of what can work, that will get replicated. So if somebody has that really funny show, and I definitely do think that show can exist. I mean, people in entertainment know about I Think You Should Leave. People know that's funny. Hopefully that will have some influence. You could have a show really take off just because it's funny, and that would change everything. So I think all you need is somebody to demonstrate to the entertainment world, hey, this can still work, and then you're off and running again.
I don't think I had fully appreciated that point, but I think you're right. I mean, you mentioned vampires, but, superhero multiverses are the thing right now, I think.
Oh, yeah, that too. Yeah. I can't tell you how superficial some people in Hollywood are in terms of making these decisions. Like Rick and Morty is a hit, and now people go, space, it's space. People like space. It's like, no, people like Rick and Morty because it's funny, but they will look at the most superficial characteristic of a thing and decide that's what people like about it. What's that?
It's the guy from Dan Harmon, right?
Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland.
Yeah, Dan Harmon from Community.
And their writing staff, which we...
Yeah, and I should say their full writing staff, but Dan Harmon from Community to Rick and Morty to some of the C-Lab I think he did, he cranks out banger after banger.
He's kind of a Mike Judge type figure now, where it's like, shit, man, you know something because you keep doing it over and over.
Community is one of my favorite shows of all time.
Community is very funny.
But yeah, no, I think you're right in that maybe this whole trend, we're seeing the end of a trend and we just haven't seen the birth of the next thing. If kind of the current wave of the 17 Daily Show clones is on its tail end, maybe it's just we have to wait 6 more months and the next thing is going to explode and we'll see what it is. I don't know.
Yeah, there's always a next thing. I wish Hollywood would figure out that the next thing doesn't look like the last thing. So please stop trying to make the last thing. But, hell, it's not my money. If I was investing money, I'd probably just put it in another Spider-Man movie. Sure.
Well, it's funny. There's that Michelle Yeoh movie, which is a multiverse, Everything Everywhere All at Once. Which
I want to see that. Is that good?
It was actually very good, yeah.
I keep hearing good things.
I enjoyed it, but there's that. The Doctor Strange movie was a multiverse. The Spider-Man movies are it's like everything is a multiverse now. So that's going to be your next few years. DC is scrambling to lick up Marvel's scraps, and we'll see what happens. But we are coming up on time. We're pushing an hour now. So what I want to do is ask our traditional final question here. What would you recommend for people who want to learn more? I will start by saying everyone should go subscribe to I Might Be Wrong. It's the Substack that Jeff Maurer writes. And there's a bunch of good articles. We'll link a couple individual articles from the Substack in the show notes. But other than that, is there anything else that you would recommend? This could be a political comedy show, people who write about comedy, who have insightful thoughts. For people who've been just fascinated by this whole discussion, what would you recommend for them?
Well, first of all, of course, my position as a Substack writer is that my Substack is all you need. But it really, literally, all entertainment is the only thing you need.
You don't even need to buy food anymore. It sustains you.
Oxygen is a luxury. Once you have my Substack, it is literally the only thing human beings need. So there's that. But beyond that, if we're talking superfluous stuff, you know what? Clickhole is really underrated. Clickhole is very funny. It's a spinoff of The Onion. And The Onion's still funny, but Clickhole is a spinoff of The Onion. And
I got to break in real quick.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see? It was like a year back where The Onion writers did some kind of groveling interview where they were like, "God, we're so sorry for making Joe Biden look cool. It was bad, and we really regret this." Like they really did. They did this, and they were like, "We have to reckon with our own role in making Joe Biden look cool." And did we stop Bernie's revolution from happening? And that was a thing I read, and I thought, that's the most sycophantic thing I've ever seen. Holy God!
I'm not going to say about this a lot about this because I know a lot about it, and I know a lot of the people involved. The one thing I will say is that was one writer. That was one writer, and I'll just go. I have some insider knowledge. The extent to which that writer was responsible for the Joe Biden character that The Onion created, Diamond Joe, the word I'm hearing is minimal. Minimal. Anyway.
Oh, there's always one bad apple.
So that's that. But anyway, Clickhole is The Onion spinoff, and it is like specifically targeted at clickbait type stuff, and it is just hyper absurdist. God, I like absurdist stuff. I mean, I grew up with Conan. Conan was absurdist. Clickhole is absurdist. I find it very funny. In terms of thinkers, I mean, there's a person who's not going to be any news to your audience. Noah Smith. Noah Smith's doing really good stuff. Noah Smith, Matt Iglesias, Josh Barrow, these are people I think they got real sharp minds. They're talking a lot of sense, and that includes zoning. We are part of like the oh my God, we need to build more community. I write about it sometimes on my Substack.
Now you're just pandering to the base.
I'm just pandering.
We appreciate it, though.
It's pandering, but it's true. We keep talking about it because it's true. We have to build more. it would have a gigantic impact on society. So there's a bunch of shit your audience already knew. Apologies. One more thing I would, because I go looking for stuff that can really, speak to me and I can really enjoy and laugh at. And so back in the category of stuff people already know about, Coen Brothers movies. My wife and I just watched Coen Brothers movies. We watched ones we've seen 5 times. Last night I watched Barton Fink for probably the 7th or 8th time. I always find something I didn't find before in there. I think movies like A Serious Man have like legitimate philosophy in them. It's really hard to find something meaningful, to find a comment that really makes you think, oh, that's a good point. I'm going to like keep that with me as I live my life. I think movies like A Serious Man have that in there. And I think if you just want fun and like funny stuff to laugh at, and you're not attached to plot, then a movie like Hail Caesar is great, where it's just kind of weird, funny stuff for 2 hours. So there we go. I've plugged some of the most successful filmmakers of the last 20 years.
Well, I'm sure the Coen brothers are going to appreciate this plug. It's going to make all the difference to them. But
yeah, their careers are really going to take off now.
Well, everyone, today's episode has explored this whole political comedy thing. I'm not sure if we learned anything. I feel like that was with the motto on Seinfeld. The motto on Seinfeld was what, like no hugging and no learning. Nobody ever learns anything. And so that's how we're going to close the podcast. We talked about a lot of stuff, but we didn't learn anything. My guest has been Jeff Maurer. Go check him out on I Might Be Wrong on Substack. Jeff, thank you for coming on the show.
Well, I'm glad I could be here to waste everyone's time. Thanks for having me.